On November 1st, 2008, David Ponce and Max Raphael were at Ponce's house in Watts checking their weapons. Ponce reached out to Max earlier in the day about backing him up and going with him to a homeless encampment to confront an individual that he had previously had a confrontation with. A week prior, Ponce was at the encampment for business-related reasons. He was attempting to square away a drug debt with one of the encampment's residents. This was a friend of his that he apparently knew before this guy fell on harder times and ended up in the homeless encampment. According to some of the police reports, Ponce was attempting to collect drug money that he had fronted to an individual by the name of Lorenzo Villacana, aka LV, that was living at the encampment. The drugs that were fronted on consignment were supposed to be collected a week before, but his constituent apparently either hadn't sold all the drugs yet or he was trying to recoup the money. The encampment is nestled off the 405 freeway, deep beneath bottle brush trees, where it is barely visible by passing motorists. You wouldn't even know it was there unless you knew it existed or unless you physically climbed through the chain link fence that has become the entranceway to this insidious underworld. There's another whole community within this encampment. Like so many other homeless sects or societies, there's a mix of drug addiction, alcoholism, starvation, poverty, prostitution, panhandling, violence, and criminal activity. The camp consists of several rows of makeshift tents that are constructed with shopping carts, boxes, tarps, rubbish, and any other materials and debris that they can use to stack and construct a shelter. Like any other community, neighbors become acquainted with neighbors. They fraternize. They help each other sometimes. There's a level of civility. And sometimes they never even speak at all. This community, like every other community, also knows when outsiders enter or when other people invade their presence that just look like they're out of place. During the day, these encampments are usually empty. Most of the residents leave to either panhandle, to score drugs, or to just go outside the perimeters of the encampment to hustle. More often than not, unless these guys have people come in there to donate food or other perishable items on a regular basis, they have to leave during the day in order to find their daily sustainment. Whether it's dumpster diving, going behind restaurants searching for scraps of food that have been discarded, whether it consists of taking leftover food left on the table at a restaurant, or whether it's just out there on the streets holding signs asking for help. This is their only hopes of survival, and this is how many of them get their daily sustainment. Others, on the other hand, are forced into prostitution or selling drugs in order to survive. It's a hopeless, dreadful, and deplorable existence, but this is just one of the many stark realities that poverty creates for people who are thrust into this toilsome lifestyle. Most homeless people become victims of drug addiction and alcoholism. Therefore, those who opt to sell drugs don't need to go far. Literally, they can go from tent to tent, marketing and selling their product. At night, in the darkness, the encampment transforms into another kind of nefarious underworld. The encampment becomes illuminated with small fires, bongs, and hot plates. The residents are sometimes walking from tent to tent, drinking and doing drugs, and it just comes to life with the type of activities that the norms of society aren't accustomed to. It's a hard world, a hard existence, and a life that most people wouldn't have the ability to adapt to. But even though these people, that others would label as street people, have seen life in some of its most rawest and harshest forms, the night of November 1st, 2008 was even enough to terrify and shock them. Sometime earlier on that day, Ponce called his homeboy Max and told him that he needed him to ride shotgun, basically to go with him while he checked this guy LV who wasn't paying him some money that he owed him. Allegedly, Ponce had already been down to the homeless encampment to talk to LV 2 or 3 times, but each time he went down there, LV apparently gave him the runaround and it eventually just escalated into an argument. LV basically told Ponce to cool his jets and to quit sweating him, that he'd get his money when he was done flipping his shit. At some point, Ponce told LV to give him whatever money he had and that he'd just come back to pick up the rest later. But LV refused complying with handling it like that and told Ponce that he didn't have all the money yet, that it was still on the streets, and that he didn't agree to do business like that. What it all came down to is this. Whether it was true or not, it looked like LV fucked the money off, and that he was in the process of making it back. On top of that, Ponce did his own research and found out that he had been getting loaded and splurging with other people that lived at the encampment. So in Ponce's mind, it looked like LV fucked all the money off and that he was just stalling for time. There's two ways of looking at this, and this comes from the perspective of someone who has experience in slinging dope. When you get dope on consignment, it's your business how you flip it, how you manage it, and who you choose to deal with. As long as you get the money back in a reasonable amount of time, and as long as you're not out there doing no sideways shit, it's your business. The only exception to that rule is if you have some specifics worked out with your connection, and if you've obligated yourself to some terms that bind you to go about it a certain way. It also becomes a little problematic if you're openly out there getting loaded on your connection shit, and if you just have a history of falling into debt. When I had runners working for me and these issues came up, it made me ride them, and I started demanding that I get whatever money they had if the rest was taking too long to dump. This sounds like what might have been happening between Ponce and LV, so I can understand the dilemma. At any rate, whatever kind of agreement these guys had worked out was irrelevant, because at the end of the day, Ponce wanted his money, and that was the bottom line. On the day Max met up with Ponce to go jam LV up, Max met Ponce at his house in Watts and brought a Springfield 1911 Garrison 45 ACP automatic Colt pistol. Ponce had a fully automatic 9mm Glock 17 Generation 5 that held 15 rounds in the clip. Ponce and Max had known each other since they were kids. They literally grew up and went to school together. Years later, they both got jumped into the same gang or neighborhood called the Nutwood Watts Gang. According to court transcripts, Ponce never told Max that he had the intentions of going down to the encampment to kill LV. His only intention was to go down there and collect his money. And he allegedly told Max if the fool didn't have his money, he was going to pistol whip him a little bit, but that one way or the other, he was going to get his money. After cleaning, checking, and loading their guns, they jumped into Ponce's car and headed towards Long Beach. When they finally got off the 405 freeway and parked in an area that was close to the entrance of the encampment, an entrance that Ponce always used, they checked their weapons one more time and got out on foot. LV's tent was towards the opposite end of the encampment, so they had to walk past most of the tents and some of the homeless residents that were sitting outside in lazy boy chairs and other makeshift seats. It was about 7 p.m. that evening, so it was already starting to get dark when they first got there. This night was no different than any other night when Ponce had gone down there before. People had small fires going, others had bongs and hot plates hooked up to car batteries so they could cook their food. As they were walking between the two rows of tents, Ponce spotted an individual by the name of Hamid Sammy Sharifat, who knew LV and who acted as one of the encampment's representatives. Sammy knew the whole layout of the encampment and had taken a lead role amongst all of those who were there. Anytime the local cops came out there and tried moving the homeless along, or anytime there was any kind of problem, Sammy was the one who came out and spoke up. His intentions were good, and he embraced all the homeless people there as his family. But unfortunately for him, this role would also end up costing him his life. When Ponce spotted Sammy, he pulled out his gun and told Sammy to show him where LV was camped out at. Sammy readily complied, leading Ponce and Max to another tent that was close to the one that Ponce remembered him originally being in. LV had apparently moved his site, which was either a huge coincidence or he was trying to throw Ponce off. Of course, Ponce didn't believe that this was a coincidence, which only resulted in him becoming more upset. When they finally got to LV's tent, Ponce allegedly told Sammy to sit on the ground and not to move until he was told to move. What happened next was derived from the statements and testimony of an informant who had knowledge about the details of the case. When Ponce opened the flap of the tent to see if LV was in there and to confront him about his money, LV was in there getting high with two other homeless people that were also living at the encampment. Two women, Vanessa Malapule and Catherine Verdun, were both sitting with LV getting high. and each was engaged in their own dabbling of preparing their next hit. Vanessa was loading a crack pipe, and Catherine was rinsing out a hypodermic syringe. When LV noticed it was Ponce, he snapped, "What the fuck are you doing? Close that shit." At that point, an argument ensued, and words were exchanged. Ponce then tried to physically grab LV to pull him outside, but LV slapped his hand away, and things continued to escalate. At that exact moment, Ponce did exactly what his impulses told him to do. He pulled out his gun, pointed at LV's forehead, and pulled the trigger. Before either Vanessa or Catherine had a chance to react, Ponce also shot them both multiple times in the head and body. In fact, Ponce emptied his whole 15-round clip into the three bodies, leaving them in a tangle of arms and legs. Meanwhile, when Sammy realized what was going on, he attempted to get up and flee, but Max shot him in the head as well. The location of these shootings just so happened to be in a clearing that was somewhat separated from the other tents and was almost at the very end of the line. However, there was only one other tent that was in close proximity to where these initial shootings took place, and an older homeless guy named Frederick Newmeyer occupied this tent. His tent was within a few feet and close enough to where he could literally hear everything that had just taken place. Without hesitation or without giving it a second thought, Max walked over to his tent, pulled the flap open, and peered inside. Newmeyer, wide awake and fully alert, looked up only to see a quick flash that ended his life before he even knew what happened. LV was the only real intended target that night, but unfortunately for the other four, they became collateral damage based solely on the fact that they were at the wrong place at the right time. As soon as Max shot Newmeyer, him and Ponce crossed back over to the far side of the encampment and began walking back towards where they had parked. Once they made their way back to Ponce's car, they drove away and continued on with life as they knew it. As with most partners in crime, they both made a pact not to talk about the murders and to never in life ever admit to it under any circumstances. Meanwhile, when authorities would later respond to the encampment, they found a man and two women all shot in the head multiple times. Their limbs were all intertwined and they were all lying in a massive pool of blood. Nearby, another man was crumpled on his side, his legs drained of color. In another tent, a fifth victim lay down in another pool of blood. The 2008 quintuple murder of the Long Beach homeless encampment was one of the city's deadliest massacres. For close to 5 years, both Ponce and Max were able to avoid law enforcement detection, and the cases went unsolved. Little or no physical evidence was left at the scene of the crime, and there was no witnesses or anyone alive who had knowledge of the crime. On March 23, 2009, Ponce forced an individual by the name of Tony Bledsoe into his car at gunpoint and drove Bledsoe to a desolate spot in the Antelope Valley near Lake Los Angeles, which skirts the western edge of the Mojave Desert. The reason for Ponce kidnapping Bledsoe at gunpoint stemmed from money Bledsoe owed him from an unpaid drug debt. The circumstances were similar to the Long Beach homeless encampment murders, but this time Ponce was riding solo. When Ponce arrived at a spot in the Antelope Valley in which he felt was desolate enough to kill Bledsoe, he pulled over and ordered Bledsoe to get out of the car. He then made Bledsoe get on his knees and shot him 4 times in the head. 2 bullets to the front of the head and 2 bullets to the back of the head. 6 months later, a woman riding her horse in the desert near Lake Los Angeles noticed her dog sniffing at something. It ended up being Bledsoe's hand that was sticking out of a very shallow, partially covered grave. After Ponce bragged about the details of the Long Beach murders and the murder of Bledsoe to his then one-time girlfriend, he was eventually charged with Bledsoe's murder after she reported the crime and the details to the authorities. She was motivated into coming forward with the information following a domestic dispute. Ponce was eventually charged and convicted for kidnapping and first-degree murder for the killing of Tony Bledsoe on March 23, 2009. While Ponce was in custody, he was apparently befriended by an individual, confidential informant, aka CI, who claimed that Ponce bragged about the details of all his crimes. The CI posed himself as being a representative of longtime reputed MA member Eulio Lalo Martinez. The informant claimed that he plied Ponce with pruno, a crude concoction of jailhouse wine manufactured from fermented fruit, sugar, and other ingredients, to loosen his tongue and as a form of truth serum. According to police reports, the CI was furnished with a recording device and was able to record all the incriminating information. Ponce believed that he had come into contact with a reputable MA representative and therefore invested all his trust into this guy. The jailhouse wine became critical as it loosened up his tongue and it apparently impaired his better judgment. During some of the recorded conversations, Ponce describes how Bledsoe prayed before he shot him. He says, "He got on his knees and then bam, 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 I shot that fool." The CI asks, "Did you bury him?" Ponce laughs and says, "No, I left him like that." In another recording of Ponce seemingly confessing to the jailhouse CI, Ponce says, "I emptied the whole clip into them homeless people. They all slumped on each other." As a result of the testimony of Ponce's girlfriend and the recordings that were made by the CI, both Ponce and Max Raphael were convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and the kidnapping of Hamid Sami Sharifat. Jurors also found true the special circumstance allegations of multiple murders during the commission of a kidnapping, and murder while being an active participant in a criminal street gang, along with gang and gun allegations. Max Raphael was sentenced on January 18, 2018 to 5 consecutive life prison terms without the possibility of parole. Ponce was also convicted of another count of first-degree murder and kidnapping in the shooting of Tony Bledsoe. He was given the death penalty where he currently resides on San Quentin's death row. The moral of the story, don't talk about the details of your case when you go into custody. No matter who someone is or who they claim to be, there's always snakes in the grass that are desperately trying to find leverage to come out from under their own legal problems. Also, don't talk about the specifics of things you've done with a wife or girlfriend. Nothing good can never come out of it. Again, you're exposing her to a lifestyle she hasn't committed herself to, and therefore, you can't expect her to be held to the same standards and morals that come with that lifestyle. Take heed from this case as well. Domestic disputes are often what motivates women to go to the cops and expose what they know. Most of the time, it's them being vindictive, but this is a situation you create, and it's a situation you can avoid. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. This is one of 5 short profiles that should be coming out this week, so be looking for them. Remember, YouTube doesn't always send out notifications to you guys, so keep an eye on our community page as we try to give you guys a heads up at least 3 or 4 hours in advance. As always, thank you guys for your support. Thank you for the positive feedback, for the constructive criticism, and just for growing with us. Like we always say, without you guys and the support you give us, we would cease to exist.